She fainted into the wrong arms. The Duke caught her. His rival saw everything. The Duchess of Richmond's ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers, until the entire space seemed to shimmer like the inside of a diamond. Lady Violet Ashworth stood at the edge of the dance floor, her gloved hand resting lightly on the arm of her betrothed, and wondered if anyone would notice if she simply stopped breathing. She had perfected the art of the pleasant smile. It sat on her face now like a mask she had worn so long. It had begun to fuse with her skin lips curved just so, eyes bright, but not too bright, expression engaged but never demanding. The Viscount Hartley preferred her this way, ornamental, quiet, present, but not particularly visible. "You're wool-gathering again." His voice was low, meant only for her ears, but it carried an edge that made her spine stiffen. "I've told you how it looks when you drift off at these events. People will think you simple. Forgive me." The words came automatically, smooth as silk, empty as air. "I was merely admiring Lady Pemberton's gown. The embroidery is quite extraordinary." Hartley's fingers tightened on her arm, a warning pressure that would leave no bruise but spoke volumes. "Then perhaps you should compliment her instead of staring like a country girl at her first ball. We've discussed this, Violet. You represent me now. Your behavior reflects on my standing." "Of course." She lowered her gaze demurely, the picture of a chastened fiancé, and felt another small piece of herself crumble to dust. 2 years. She had been engaged to Edward Hartley, Viscount Hartley, for 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She knew the count precisely because she marked each day on her calendar with a small dot of ink, watching the constellation of her remaining freedom grow ever larger, ever darker, as the wedding date approached. The match had been her father's doing. The Earl of Thornbury had a talent for cards, and an absolute absence of talent for knowing when to walk away from the table. By the time Violet was 21, he had gambled away everything that wasn't entailed, and the family had survived only because Hartley had offered to settle the debts in exchange for her hand. A business transaction. That was what her mother had called it, as though the words made it less terrible. Violet had been purchased like a piece of horseflesh, her value calculated in her father's vowels, and she had smiled and accepted because that was what daughters did. Because she had been raised to understand that her opinions were ornaments, pleasant but ultimately decorative, not meant to bear any weight. Now she stood in the most glittering ballroom in London, surrounded by the cream of society, and felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. "Hartley!" A voice boomed across the crowd, and Violet watched her betrothed's face transform. The cold irritation vanished, replaced by the charming warmth he showed the world, the easy smile, the crinkling eyes, the manner that had fooled her completely in those early days. "Haven't seen you at White's this week? Been hiding from the tables?" "Simply spending time with my lovely bride-to-be." Hartley's hand slid from Violet's arm to her waist, pulling her against his side in a gesture that might have looked affectionate if she couldn't feel the possessive grip beneath the silk of her gown. "Can you blame me? Only 3 weeks until the wedding. I want to savor every moment." The gentleman laughed, something about Hartley being a changed man, and Violet let the conversation wash over her without truly hearing it. Her head had begun to ache, a dull throb behind her eyes that made the candlelight seem too bright, too sharp. She had not eaten dinner, could not eat dinner. Not with Hartley watching her portions and commenting on her figure, and the champagne she had drunk too quickly now churned uneasily in her empty stomach. She turned her head slightly, seeking a point of stillness in the swirling crowd, and her gaze collided with a pair of grey eyes across the ballroom. The Duke of Ashworth. She knew him by reputation, only everyone in the ton knew him by reputation. The Iron Duke, they called him, though never to his face. Cold as winter, hard as the stone walls of his ancestral estate, and utterly indifferent to the legions of mammas who had paraded their daughters before him for the past decade. He was 32 years old, possessed of a fortune that made even Hartley's wealth look modest, and had never shown the slightest interest in taking a wife. He was also the most unsettling man Violet had ever seen. Not handsome, precisely. His face was too severe for that, all sharp angles and a jaw that suggested he had never backed down from anything in his life. His dark hair had begun to silver at the temples, though he was young for such marks of age, and it gave him the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. But his eyes, those grey eyes, pale as morning fog, sharp as broken glass, they seemed to see straight through the pretty mask Violet wore to the hollow woman beneath. He was watching her. She did not know why, and the not knowing made her heart beat faster than it had any right to. They had never been introduced, had never spoken, had no connection whatsoever. Yet she felt his gaze like a physical touch, like pressure against her skin, and something in her chest that had been sleeping for years stirred restlessly in response. "Violet." Hartley's voice cut through her awareness, edged with warning. "Lord Pemberton asked you a question." She wrenched her attention back to the conversation, heat flooding her cheeks. "I do apologize, my lord. The warmth in here is quite overwhelming. What were you asking?" But even as she summoned another pleasant smile, even as she answered whatever inane question about wedding preparations Lord Pemberton had posed, she could feel those grey eyes on her still. Watching. Assessing. Seeing. The thought terrified her more than she could explain. An hour passed, perhaps more. Time moved strangely at these events, stretched thin by boredom and squeezed tight by anxiety until Violet could never quite tell how long she had been standing, smiling, performing. Hartley had released her to dance with Lady Pemberton, a political move. Something about her husband's influence in Parliament, and Violet found herself briefly, blessedly alone at the edge of the ballroom. The air pressed against her like a living thing, thick with perfume and candle smoke, and the heat of 500 bodies in an enclosed space. Her corset felt tighter than it had at the start of the evening. Though that was impossible, the maid had laced it the same as always, perhaps even a touch looser in deference to the long night ahead. But every breath seemed to require effort, as though her lungs had forgotten how to expand, and the room had begun to spin in lazy, nauseating circles. She needed air. The terrace was only 20 feet away. If she could just— "Lady Violet, are you quite well?" A woman's voice, concerned, coming from somewhere to her left. Violet turned to answer, and the room tilted violently. She started, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy, and the words dissolved before she could form them. The edges of her vision darkened. The chandelier above her fractured into 1,000 glittering shards. She reached for something to steady herself, found nothing but air, and felt her body begin to fall. The last thing she saw before consciousness abandoned her was a flash of grey eyes, grey evening coat, grey everything, and then strong arms caught her, and the world went black. Sebastian Thornwood, Duke of Ashworth, had not intended to attend the Duchess of Richmond's ball. He had not intended to attend any ball this season, or any season. Social events required a performance he found exhausting, a parade of polite smiles and empty conversation that served no purpose except to remind him why he preferred his own company. But his aunt, the formidable Lady Thornwood, had issued an ultimatum that morning. Either he would attend tonight's ball and dance at least once, or she would begin inviting eligible young ladies to dinner at his townhouse, and she would not stop until he was either engaged or driven to madness. Given the options, he had chosen the ball. He had spent most of the evening stationed near a pillar at the far end of the ballroom, nursing a glass of brandy and deflecting the attempts of matchmaking mammas with a coldness that had become second nature. The Ice Duke, the Iron Duke, the Duke of nothing at all. He had heard all the names, had earned them honestly through years of deliberate distance, and he wore them like armor against a world that had taught him, young and viciously, the cost of letting anyone too close. He had almost succeeded in making it through the evening, unscathed when he noticed her. She stood beside Hartley. Of course she did. because the universe had a cruel sense of humor, her hand on his arm, like a delicate bird resting on a branch. Sebastian knew who she was. Lady Violet Ashworth, the Earl of Thornbury's youngest daughter, betrothed these past 2 years to the man Sebastian despised more than any other living soul. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. Her features were too irregular for classical beauty, her copper-gold hair too bright, her freckles too visible, despite what was clearly an attempt to powder them into submission. But there was something about her that snagged his attention and refused to let go a quality of stillness beneath her social performance, as though she were watching the world from behind glass, present but unreachable. And her eyes. God, her eyes. Green as spring leaves, wide and expressive, revealing far too much of what she felt to be wise in this shark-infested ballroom. When she thought no one was watching, those eyes went flat and empty in a way that Sebastian recognized from his own mirror. The look of someone slowly disappearing. He should not have watched her. He knew that, even as he tracked her movements across the ballroom with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was Hartley's intended, which meant she was untouchable, unthinkable, completely beyond the pale. Whatever game Hartley was playing with her, and Hartley was always playing a game, it was none of Sebastian's concern. And yet, he watched her smile at Lord Pemberton and saw the way it never reached her eyes. He watched Hartley's hand on her waist and saw the almost imperceptible flinch she could not quite suppress. He watched her steal a glance in his direction, their gazes meeting for a moment that felt like an eternity, and he saw something flare in those green depths. Fear, yes, but also something that looked almost like recognition, as though she saw him too. Not the Ice Duke, not the Iron Duke, not the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world, but him, the broken thing beneath the armor. It was impossible. They had never met, never spoken. She could not possibly know him. And yet the recognition in her eyes made something long dormant stir in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. He was still wrestling with that unsettling awareness when she broke away from the group she'd been speaking with and began to move toward the terrace. Her steps were unsteady, he noticed immediately, with an attentiveness that alarmed him, and her face had gone pale beneath the powder and rouge. Something was wrong. Sebastian set down his brandy and began to move through the crowd, not running a duke never ran, but walking with a purpose that made people instinctively step out of his way. He did not know what he intended to do. Offer assistance, perhaps, though that would be scandalous given their lack of introduction. Call for a servant. Something, anything to chase away the creeping dread that something terrible was about to happen. He was 10 feet away when she turned toward a woman who had spoken to her, her lips parting to respond, and then her eyes rolled back and her body crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. Sebastian moved without thought. His arms closed around her before she could hit the floor, one hand catching her shoulders, the other supporting her waist, her slight weight settling against his chest as naturally as though she had always belonged there. Her head lolled against his shoulder, copper hair tumbling loose from its elaborate arrangement, and the scent of her rose water and something sweeter, something that made him think of summer gardens rose to envelop him. For a moment, that stretched into eternity, Sebastian stood frozen in the middle of the Duchess of Richmond's ballroom, holding an unconscious woman in his arms, while 500 members of the Ton watched in absolute silence. Then the whispers began. Good God! Is that the Duke of Ashworth? Can you imagine? But isn't she engaged to Hartley? Look at his face. Sebastian lifted his head and met the gaze of his oldest enemy across the crowded ballroom. Edward Hartley stood at the edge of the dance floor, his face a mask of polished rage. 15 years since Oxford, and Sebastian still knew every tell the white lines around Hartley's mouth, the slight flaring of his nostrils, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was furious. Beyond furious. Incandescent with a hatred that had simmered between them since they were young men and showed no signs of cooling. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as Hartley began to move toward them. Ashworth. His voice was pleasant, society smooth, but his eyes promised murder. How fortunate that you happened to be nearby when my betrothed became indisposed. I'll take her now. He reached for Violet, still unconscious, still limp in Sebastian's arms. Her breathing shallow but steady, and something dark and possessive roared to life in Sebastian's chest. I think not. The words emerged before he could stop them, ice-cold and implacable. Lady Violet requires a physician, not to be hauled about by someone who failed to notice she was on the verge of collapse. A muscle twitched in Hartley's jaw. She is my responsibility. She is currently in my arms. Sebastian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The threat was clear enough without volume. And she will remain there until she has been seen by a competent medical professional, unless you'd like to create more of a scene than we already have. He gestured with his chin toward the crowd, which had grown substantially since Violet's collapse. Half the ton was watching them now, eyes bright with the particular hunger that accompanied truly exceptional scandal. A fainting lady was noteworthy. A fainting lady caught by a duke who was not her betrothed was unprecedented. Hartley's expression flickered, calculation replacing rage for a brief moment before the pleasant mask slid back into place. Of course, Lady Violet's health is paramount. Perhaps we might continue this discussion somewhere more private. Indeed. Sebastian turned without waiting for agreement and began to carry Violet toward the anteroom he had spotted earlier, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea before Moses. He was aware of Hartley following, aware of the whispers that trailed in his wake like the train of a wedding gown, aware that he had just made a spectacle of himself in a way that would fuel gossip for the next month. He did not care. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, her shallow breathing, her pale face, the faint flutter of her pulse against his wrist. The anteroom was small but private, separated from the ballroom by heavy velvet curtains. Sebastian laid Violet carefully on a fainting couch, noting with clinical detachment that her colour was already beginning to return, that her breathing had steadied. A simple faint then, brought on by heat or hunger, or the crushing pressure of a corset laced too tight. She would recover. "A physician," he said to the footman who had followed them, and the man disappeared with gratifying speed. "Really, Ashworth?" Hartley had entered behind them, positioning himself near the door with the air of a man guarding his territory. "All this fuss over a simple swoon. Violet has always been delicate. She'll be fine in a moment." "Delicate?" Sebastian repeated the word flatly. "Is that what you call a woman who clearly hasn't been eating properly?" Hartley's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" Her colouring, the shadows under her eyes, the way her gown hangs too loose on her frame. Sebastian catalogued the evidence without emotion, though something cold and angry was building in his chest. "A lady who is properly cared for does not faint at balls, Hartley, unless, of course, she is being starved into submission." For a moment, Hartley's mask slipped completely, and Sebastian saw the true face beneath the cruelty, the petty viciousness, the absolute conviction that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, and everyone else could be damned. It was the same face Sebastian had seen 15 years ago, when Hartley had destroyed an innocent girl to win a wager, and Sebastian had been too young and too powerless to stop him. He was not powerless any more. "You go too far." Hartley's voice was low, dangerous. "My betrothed is none of your concern. Whatever game you think you're playing, I'm playing no game." Sebastian stepped forward, using every inch of his height to tower over the shorter man. "But I will tell you this once, Hartley. and I will not repeat myself. If I learn that Lady Violet has been mistreated in any way, if I see so much as a shadow of distress in her eyes, I will make it my personal mission to destroy you. Socially, financially, completely. Do I make myself clear?" Hartley's face flushed an ugly shade of red. "You dare! I dare!" Sebastian's voice was soft, almost gentle, and all the more frightening for it. "You know exactly what I'm capable of, and you know I don't make idle threats." Before Hartley could respond, a small sound from the fainting couch drew both their attention. Violet was waking up. The first thing Violet became aware of was the softness beneath her velvet, from the texture, finer than anything in her own home. The second was the voices, low and male, crackling with an animosity that made her instincts scream even before she could make out the words. "Make myself clear? You dare? I dare." She opened her eyes. The room swam into focus slowly. A small chamber, dimly lit, dominated by the fainting couch on which she lay, and the two men who stood facing each other like duelists, waiting for the signal to fire. Hartley's back was to her, his posture rigid with fury, and before him, tall and dark and absolutely immovable, stood the Duke of Ashworth. Those grey eyes shifted to her face, and something in them softened almost imperceptibly. "Lady Violet." His voice was low, careful, as though she were a wild creature who might startle. "Please don't try to rise too quickly. You fainted in the ballroom." The ballroom, the heat, the spinning room, falling. And then, oh God, she had fainted into the Duke of Ashworth's arms, in front of everyone. Her voice emerged as a croak, and she swallowed hard, trying again. "I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what happened. I never faint. You will apologize to me." Hartley had turned now, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You frightened me half to death, darling. When I saw you collapse—" "When you saw her collapse, you were on the other side of the room." The Duke's interruption was smooth, almost casual, but something in his tone made Hartley fall silent. "I believe a physician has been summoned. In the meantime, Lady Violet, might I offer you some water?" There was a crystal carafe on a side table, and before Violet could respond, the Duke had poured a glass and was holding it out to her with surprising gentleness. She took it with trembling fingers, acutely aware of the contrast between his calm courtesy and Hartley's barely concealed rage. "Thank you, Your Grace." The water was cool and sweet, and she drank gratefully, feeling clarity return with each swallow. "I truly am sorry for the inconvenience. The heat was simply—" "You have nothing to apologize for." Again that softness in his grey eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Ballrooms are designed for display, not comfort. It's a wonder more ladies don't succumb." "Yes, well." Hartley stepped forward, placing himself between Violet and the Duke with a proprietary air that made her stomach clench. "I believe my betrothed has recovered sufficiently to be escorted home. Thank you for your assistance, Ashworth. I trust this matter need not be discussed further." A beat of silence. Then the Duke smiled, if such a cold, sharp expression could be called a smile, and inclined his head. "Of course. Lady Violet's reputation is paramount, though I believe the Ton may have their own opinions about what they witnessed tonight." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy as thunder. 500 people had seen the Duke of Ashworth catch Hartley's betrothed. By tomorrow the gossip would be in every drawing-room in London. Hartley's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the curtain parted and an elderly physician bustled in, black bag in hand, demanding to know what all the fuss was about. In the confusion of the examination, pulse checked, smelling salts waved, questions about eating and sleeping and the tightness of stays. Violet lost sight of the Duke. By the time the physician pronounced her fit to travel, provided she rested for several days, Ashworth had vanished entirely, leaving only the faint scent of sandalwood and the memory of grey eyes that saw too much. Hartley's carriage was summoned. His hand on her arm was bruising as he helped her inside, his silence more frightening than any tirade could have been. Violet stared out the window at the passing street lamps and wondered if she had imagined the whole thing, the connection she had felt, the softness in the Duke's expression, the inexplicable sense that, for one brief moment, she had been seen. "We will discuss this at length tomorrow." Hartley's voice cut through the darkness, cold and precise. "Tonight, you will go directly to bed and speak to no one. I will manage the scandal as best I can, though your carelessness has made that task considerably more difficult." "I didn't mean to faint." "You didn't mean." He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "That is always your excuse, isn't it, Violet? You didn't mean to embarrass me. You didn't mean to make a spectacle. You didn't mean to fall into the arms of another man in front of the entire ton." His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "What you meant matters considerably less than what you did." Violet said nothing. There was nothing to say. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and let the tears she had been suppressing slide silently down her cheeks. Sebastian did not go home. Instead, he walked through Mayfair's lamplit streets, past shuttered townhouses and sleepy night watchmen, with no destination in mind except away. Away from the ballroom, away from the whispers, away from the memory of grey-green eyes looking up at him as though he had hung the moon, when all he had done was catch her before she fell. The night air was cool against his heated face, carrying the distant sounds of revelry from other houses where the season's entertainments continued without him. He walked until his feet ached in his evening shoes, until the first grey light of dawn began to creep over the rooftops, until his racing thoughts finally slowed enough for him to examine what had happened. He had caught a woman. That was all. A simple act of proximity and reflexes. Nothing more. It meant nothing that she was beautiful, that she was engaged to his oldest enemy, that the feeling of her in his arms had awakened something he had thought dead for 15 years. It meant nothing. And yet, Sebastian found himself in Hyde Park as the sun rose, sitting on a bench near the Serpentine, while the city slowly came to life around him. Milk carts rattled past. Servants hurried to their morning duties. A pair of ducks glided across the water, leaving silver trails in their wake. He thought about Oxford, about Eleanor Blackwood, the vicar's daughter who had made the mistake of attracting Hartley's attention during their final year. About the wager Hartley had made that he could ruin her within a month, and the systematic campaign of seduction and abandonment that had followed. About Eleanor's face when Sebastian had found her afterward, shattered and bleeding and beyond any comfort he could offer. She had drowned herself in the Cherwell 3 days later. Sebastian had been young then, powerless and naive, with no title and no influence to wield against a viscount's son. He had tried to intervene, had begged Eleanor's father to act, had even confronted Hartley directly and been laughed at for his trouble. "What does it matter?" Hartley had asked, genuinely puzzled. "She was nothing, a nobody. I was bored and she provided entertainment." Sebastian had sworn that day that he would never let anyone close enough to be used against him. He had built his walls high and thick and impenetrable, becoming the ice duke that society mocked and feared in equal measure. It was safer that way, cleaner. No one could hurt him if there was no one he cared about. For 15 years that armor had held. And then, last night, a woman with copper hair and sad green eyes had collapsed in his arms, and he had felt the first cracks beginning to form. "Damn her," he muttered, and did not know if he meant Lady Violet or himself. "Damn all of it." The ducks continued their serene progress across the water, indifferent to the turmoil of dukes. Sebastian watched them until the sun was fully up, and the park began to fill with riders and nursemaids, and ladies taking their morning constitutionals. Then he rose, straightened his crumpled evening clothes, and went home to face whatever scandal the morning papers would bring. Violet did not sleep. She lay in her darkened bedroom, still wearing her ball gown because she had dismissed her maid rather than face any questions, and stared at the canopy above her bed while her mind replayed the evening's events in an endless, torturous loop. The Duke's arms, strong and sure around her, the gentleness in his voice when he offered her water, the way he had stood between her and Hartley, immovable as a mountain, the way he had looked at her. It was madness, of course. The Duke of Ashworth was famous for his coldness, his indifference, his absolute lack of interest in any woman who crossed his path. He had probably caught her out of reflex, nothing more, and any softness she had imagined was simply the product of her oxygen-starved brain. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the press of his chest against her cheek, solid and warm. She could still smell the scent of sandalwood that clung to his coat. She could still hear his voice, cutting through Hartley's bluster with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "If I learn that Lady Violet has been mistreated in any way, if I see so much as a shadow of distress in her eyes, I will make it my personal mission to destroy you." Had she dreamed those words? She must have. Why would the Duke of Ashworth, a man she had never met, never spoken to, never so much as been introduced to concern himself with her welfare? But she had heard them, and they had settled into her chest like a coal, small and hot and impossible to ignore. Someone had seen her distress. Someone had cared enough to threaten her betrothed on her behalf. Someone had, for one brief moment, made her feel like she mattered. The tears came again, and this time Violet did not try to stop them. She cried for the girl she had been before her father's debts had sold her to a monster. She cried for the woman she had become, hollow and silent and slowly disappearing. She cried for the future that stretched before her, like a prison sentence, 3 weeks until she would be Hartley's wife in truth, and there would be no escape at all. And somewhere beneath the grief and the fear, something else stirred something that felt dangerously like hope. The first light of dawn crept through her curtains. Somewhere in the city, a church bell began to toll the hour. Violet wiped her eyes, sat up in bed, and made a decision that she did not quite understand, but could not ignore. She would see the Duke of Ashworth again. She did not know how, or when, or what she would say if she managed it. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years she had felt truly alive, and the feeling had come from the arms of a man who was not her betrothed. It was dangerous. It was impossible. It was almost certainly doomed to end in disaster. But as the sun rose over London, and the scandal of the Duchess of Richmond's ball began to spread through the gossip networks of the Ton, Violet found that she did not care. She had fainted into the wrong arms. And somehow, impossibly, they had turned out to be exactly right. The scandal sheets were merciless. Violet sat at her dressing table 3 days after the ball, staring at the latest edition of the Morning Tatler that her sister Caroline had smuggled into her room. The headline screamed across the page in bold black ink: "Lady V swoons into Iron Duke's embrace. Viscount H witnesses all." The accompanying illustration showed a woman with exaggerated copper curls draped dramatically across the arms of a dark, towering figure, while a shorter man looked on with comical outrage. It would have been funny if it weren't her life being dissected for public entertainment. "You should burn that." Caroline's voice was gentle as she settled onto the edge of Violet's bed. At 28, Caroline was everything Violet was not: steady, practical, happily married to a country squire who adored her. She had come to London specifically to help with wedding preparations, though Violet suspected she had also come to assess the situation with Hartley. Caroline had never liked him. Reading it again won't change what it says. I'm not reading it again. I'm memorizing it. Violet traced the crude drawing with one fingertip. Do you think this is how people actually see me? Wilting and helpless? I think people see what they want to see. Caroline moved to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. More importantly, I think you need to tell me what's really happening with your betrothed. And don't give me the story you've been telling Mother. I want the truth. The truth. Such a simple request, and yet the words stuck in Violet's throat like broken glass. She had spent 2 years learning to swallow her truth, to bury it so deep that even she could barely find it anymore. The idea of dragging it back into the light felt impossible, dangerous, somehow, as though speaking the words aloud would make them more real. Violet. Caroline's hands settled on her shoulders, warm and firm. I've seen the way you flinch when he touches you. I've noticed how you've stopped eating when he's watching. I know you've been writing letters and then burning them before you send them. Whatever is happening, you don't have to face it alone. The tears came without warning, sliding silently down Violet's cheeks and dripping onto the scandal sheet below. She watched them blur the ink, smearing Lady V's face into something unrecognizable, and felt something crack open inside her chest. He's not... She stopped, tried again. He's never struck me. I want you to understand that. He's never left a mark. There are ways of hurting someone that don't leave visible marks. Yes. The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. Yes, there are. The story came out in fragments, halting and disjointed, the cutting remarks disguised as concern, the constant criticism of her appearance, her manners, her very existence, the way he monitored what she ate, what she wore, who she spoke to. The letters he had started sending in the past few months, increasingly possessive, increasingly threatening, making it clear that he considered her his property and would brook no defiance. He tells me I'm lucky he's willing to take me, Violet said, her voice flat and empty. Given Father's debts, given my age, given my inadequacies. He says no one else would have me. He says I should be grateful. That's absurd. Caroline's reflection had gone pale with fury. You are beautiful and clever and kind, and any man would be fortunate to have you. Hartley is the one who should be grateful, and the fact that he's convinced you otherwise shows exactly what kind of monster he truly is. Monster. It was the first time anyone had named it so directly, and the word hit Violet like a physical blow. She had spent so long minimizing, excusing, explaining away, telling herself it could be worse, that at least he didn't hit her, that perhaps she really was as difficult as he claimed. Hearing Caroline call him what he was made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. I can't break the engagement, she said dully. Father's debts can be managed another way. There are always other ways. Caroline's grip tightened on her shoulders. Violet, listen to me. 3 weeks. You have 3 weeks before you're bound to this man for the rest of your life. Once you're married, he will own you legally, completely. Everything you have will become his. Every choice you make will require his permission. Is that truly the future you want? No. The answer rose up from somewhere deep inside her, fierce and certain and absolutely terrifying. No, it was not the future she wanted. But wanting and having were very different things, and Violet had learned long ago that her wants meant nothing in the face of duty and debt. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I don't know how to stop this. I've been silent for so long that I've forgotten how to speak. Caroline was quiet for a long moment. Then she released Violet's shoulders and moved to sit in the chair beside the dressing table, her expression thoughtful. The house party, she said slowly. Lady Helena Thornwood's gathering at Rosewood Park. You're still invited, aren't you? Violet nodded. Lady Helena was a friend of Caroline's from their debut year, a cheerful widow with a sharp wit and a talent for bringing interesting people together. Her summer house parties were legendary among the ton informal, relaxed, far from the rigid strictures of London society. Violet had been looking forward to the week in the country as a brief respite before her wedding. Hartley can't attend, Caroline continued. I heard him telling Father that he has business in London that will keep him occupied. Something about creditors, though he tried to make it sound more dignified than that. You think I should still go? I think you should go and use the time to remember who you are when you're not being crushed under that man's thumb." Caroline leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I think you should breathe and laugh and eat whatever you want and speak your mind without fear of punishment. And I think that when you come back, you might find that you have the strength to make a different choice." It sounded like a fantasy, a beautiful, impossible dream that could never survive contact with reality. Hartley would never truly let her out of his sight. He would find some way to monitor her, to control her, even from a distance. And yet, Lady Helena's house party, a week in the country. And if the gossip was to be believed, one of Lady Helena's cousins would also be in attendance. The Duke of Ashworth. Violet's heart stuttered at the thought. She had not seen him since the ball, had heard nothing except the endless speculation in the scandal sheets. But she had thought of him constantly, his grey eyes, his gentle hands, the way he had stood between her and Hartley like a shield. "I'll go," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Tell Mother I need the country air to recover from my fainting spell. Tell Father it's important for my reputation to be seen behaving normally. Tell them whatever you need to tell them." Caroline smiled, and there was something like pride in her expression. "There she is," she said softly. "There's my sister. I was starting to think she'd disappeared entirely." Violet looked at her reflection in the mirror, pale, tired, with shadows under her eyes that no amount of powder could conceal. She looked like a ghost of the girl she had once been, but somewhere beneath the exhaustion, something was stirring, something that felt almost like hope. Rosewood Park was beautiful in high summer, its rolling lawns dotted with ancient oaks, and its gardens bursting with roses in every shade, from palest blush to deepest crimson. The house itself was a rambling Georgian manor, comfortable rather than grand, with none of the intimidating formality of the great aristocratic estates. Violet arrived on a Thursday afternoon, having endured 3 days of Hartley's cold fury before her departure. He had made his displeasure clear in a dozen small ways, a grip too tight on her arm, a comment too cutting about her appearance, a letter delivered to her bedroom that outlined in explicit detail what he expected from her behavior in the country. She was not to dance with any gentleman more than once. She was not to engage in private conversation with anyone he had not approved. She was certainly not to embarrass him further with any repetition of her performance at the Duchess of Richmond's ball. She had read the letter twice, then burned it in her bedroom fireplace and watched the ashes crumble to nothing. Lady Helena greeted her at the door with an embrace that was almost inappropriately warm, her round face beaming with genuine pleasure. "My dear Lady Violet, I'm so delighted you could come. Caroline has told me so much about you, I feel as though we're already friends." "Lady Helena?" Violet found herself smiling in spite of everything. "Thank you for your kind invitation. Your home is lovely." "Rosewood is my haven," Helena said, linking her arm through Violet's and guiding her into the house. "I come here whenever London becomes too suffocating, which is to say, constantly. Now I've put you in the blue room, it has the loveliest view of the garden, and I thought you might appreciate the quiet. Most of the other guests are in the east wing, but I sensed you might need some peace." The perceptiveness of the comment made Violet's chest tighten. "That's very thoughtful of you. I try to pay attention." Helena's voice was light, but her eyes were knowing. Life is difficult enough without adding unnecessary burdens. And speaking of unnecessary burdens, I should warn you my cousin Sebastian is expected to arrive this evening, the Duke of Ashworth. She paused, watching Violet's reaction. "I understand you've already met, after a fashion." Heat flooded Violet's cheeks. "The papers have exaggerated. The papers always exaggerate. I'm far more interested in the truth." Helena patted her arm gently. "Sebastian is a good man, whatever society may say about him. Cold, yes. Difficult, certainly. But good, in his bones, where it matters. I thought you should know that before you encounter him again." Before Violet could formulate a response, a footman appeared to show her to her room, and the moment passed. But Helena's words stayed with her as she unpacked her trunks, as she changed out of her travelling clothes, as she stood at the window of the blue room and watched the shadows lengthen across the rose garden below. A good man. She had seen glimpses of that goodness at the ball, in the gentleness of his hands and the fury in his voice when he confronted Hartley. But she had also seen his coldness, his reserve, the walls he kept between himself and the world. Which was the true Sebastian Thornwood? The Iron Duke of reputation, or the man who had caught a falling woman and refused to let her go? She would find out soon enough. Dinner that evening was a casual affair, with 15 guests gathered around a table that could easily have seated 30. The conversation flowed easily, assisted by excellent wine and Lady Helena's gift for drawing even the shyest guests into discussion. Violet found herself seated between a charming young poet named Mr. Ellsworth and an elderly dowager who regaled her with scandalous stories from the court of George III. She almost managed to forget that she was waiting for someone. Almost. He arrived late, when the fish course had already been cleared and the roast was being served. The footman announced him with the studied neutrality of well-trained staff, but Violet felt the shift in the room's energy, the way conversations paused, the way eyes turned toward the doorway, the way the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. "Sebastian." Helena rose from her seat with evident pleasure. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." "My apologies." His voice was exactly as Violet remembered, low, controlled, with an undercurrent of something that might have been warmth, or might have been carefully suppressed irritation. "The roads from London were more congested than expected." He moved into the room, and Violet's breath caught in her throat. He was dressed simply for a duke, in a dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and a waistcoat of grey silk that matched his eyes. Those eyes swept the table, cataloguing faces, assessing the social landscape with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life navigating dangerous waters. When his gaze reached Violet, it stopped. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other. Violet felt pinned in place by the intensity of his regard, stripped bare by those grey eyes that seemed to see past her careful composure to the chaos beneath. She should look away. She should smile politely and return to her conversation with Mr. Ellsworth. She should do anything except sit there frozen, while her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire table could hear it. She did none of those things. "Your Grace." Helena's voice broke the spell, light and amused. "I believe you know most of my guests, but allow me to make a few introductions. Lady Violet Ashworth. I understand you met briefly at the Duchess of Richmond's ball." Briefly. Violet almost laughed at the understatement. Sebastian inclined his head, his expression carefully neutral. "Lady Violet, I trust you've recovered from your indisposition?" "Completely, Your Grace." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too breathless by half. "Thank you for your concern." "Not at all." He moved to his seat at the far end of the table, as far from Violet as it was possible to be while still remaining in the same room. She watched him settle into conversation with the lady beside him, his attention apparently claimed entirely, and told herself firmly that she was not disappointed. She was not disappointed at all. The next 3 days passed in a blur of gentle activity. Rosewood Park offered all the diversions a country house party could provide: croquet on the lawn, cards in the evening, long walks through the surrounding countryside, picnics beside the ornamental lake. Lady Helena proved to be an excellent hostess, intuiting what each guest needed and providing it without ever seeming to try. For Violet, that meant space to breathe, freedom from scrutiny, the rare luxury of spending time in company without constantly monitoring herself for missteps. She began to eat again. Not much. At first, years of Hartley's surveillance had left her stomach knotted with anxiety, but more than she had managed in months. She stopped checking her posture every few seconds, stopped analyzing each word before it left her mouth, stopped bracing for criticism that never came, and she watched the Duke of Ashworth. She tried to be subtle about it, but subtlety had never been her strong suit. She watched him at breakfast, methodically working his way through eggs and toast while reading correspondence that seemed to trouble him. She watched him in the garden, walking alone with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression distant and unreadable. She watched him in the drawing-room after dinner, standing apart from the other guests with a glass of brandy, his grey eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. He was always alone, she realized. Even in a crowd, even surrounded by people who clearly wanted his attention, he maintained a careful distance, as though he were observing life rather than participating in it. It made her ache in ways she didn't fully understand. On the fourth day, Violet rose before dawn. She couldn't sleep, hadn't been able to sleep properly since the ball, her dreams haunted by grey eyes and strong arms, and the terrible, impossible hope that she had no right to feel. Rather than lie in bed staring at the ceiling, she dressed quietly in her simplest morning gown and slipped out of the house through a side door, seeking the peace of the rose garden in the thin grey light. The garden was cool and quiet, the air heavy with dew and the heady scent of hundreds of blooms. Violet walked slowly along the gravel paths, trailing her fingers across petals, letting the beauty seep into her tired soul. She was so absorbed in the flowers that she almost walked directly into the Duke of Ashworth. "Lady Violet." His voice made her jump, her hand flying to her chest. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to startle you." He stood at the intersection of two paths, dressed in riding clothes that suggested he had been up for some time. His dark hair was slightly dishevelled, as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless night. "Your Grace." She struggled to compose herself, intensely aware of her own informal appearance. No maid, no proper coiffure, no chaperone. If anyone saw them together like this. "I didn't expect to find anyone else about at this hour." "Nor did I." A pause, weighted with something she couldn't quite identify. "I find I'm sleeping poorly of late." "As am I." The admission hung between them, more intimate than either had intended. Violet felt heat creep up her neck and looked away, focusing on a nearby rose bush, as though it held the secrets of the universe. "Would you—" Sebastian stopped, started again. "That is, if you're not otherwise occupied, would you care to walk with me? The path around the lake is quite pleasant at this hour." She should refuse. Every instinct of propriety screamed that she should refuse, that walking alone with an unmarried duke in the early morning light was the height of impropriety, that Hartley would be furious if he ever discovered it. Hartley. The thought of him hardened something inside her, turned fear into defiance. "I would like that very much, Your Grace." They walked in silence for the first quarter-mile, following the winding path that circled the ornamental lake. The water was still as glass, reflecting the pale pink sky like a mirror, and the only sounds were birdsong and the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet. It should have been awkward. By all rights, two near strangers with no proper chaperone should have been drowning in uncomfortable silence. Instead, Violet found herself relaxing into the quiet, letting it wrap around her like a blanket. There was something restful about Sebastian's presence, a steadiness that asked nothing of her, expected nothing, simply accepted her company without judgment. "You seem different here," he said finally, his voice low enough that she had to lean slightly closer to hear him. "Than you did in London." "Do I?" "At the ball, you looked like—" He paused, searching for words. "Like a bird in a cage. Beautiful, but trapped. Here, you seem more yourself." The observation was so accurate that it stole her breath. "I didn't know you were watching me that closely. I couldn't seem to look away." The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, as though it had escaped against his will. "Which is unlike me. I make a practice of not noticing people." "Why?" The question hung between them. Violet watched his profile as they walked the sharp line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his mouth compressed as he considered his answer. "Because noticing leads to caring," he said at last, "and caring leads to vulnerability. I learned young that vulnerability invites destruction." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard anyone say, and it made her heart ache with recognition. "I know something about that." She spoke carefully, testing the words like stones in a river. "About learning to hide yourself to stay safe. About building walls so high you forget what you're protecting." He glanced at her sharply, those grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You're betrothed." It wasn't a question. "I don't—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not sure what you know about Lord Hartley." "Enough." The word was flat, hard as iron. "I've known Hartley for 15 years, Lady Violet. Since we were at Oxford together, I know precisely what kind of man he is." "Then you understand why I—" She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Why I perform. Why I hide. Why I was disappearing into nothing before the night I fell into your arms." "I understand." Sebastian's voice had gentled, though his expression remained grim. "What I don't understand is why your family allowed the engagement in the first place. You deserve far better than my father's debts." The words came out bitter, sharper than she intended. "I was sold to pay for his gambling losses. It wasn't precisely presented that way, of course. There was talk of excellent matches and comfortable futures and all the pretty phrases families use to disguise the truth. But in the end, it came down to money. Hartley offered to settle the debts, and I was the price." For a long moment, Sebastian said nothing. They had reached the far side of the lake, where a stone bench offered a view across the water toward the house. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That shouldn't have happened to you." "No." Violet felt the tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "It shouldn't have happened. But it did. And now I have 3 weeks. 2 weeks. Now before I become his wife. Before I'm legally his property. Before I lose whatever small scraps of myself I've managed to keep. You could break the engagement. My father would be ruined, my family disgraced, my sisters would suffer for my selfishness. And if you marry him, you will suffer, every day, for the rest of your life." Sebastian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "Is that not worth considering? Your own suffering?" The question cracked something open inside her. "I don't know any more." The words emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I've spent so long being told that my feelings don't matter, that my wants are selfish, that my only value lies in what I can provide for others. I've heard it so many times that I started to believe it, that I am nothing, that my happiness is not worth fighting for." "That," Sebastian said quietly, "is the greatest lie ever told." And then, before she could respond, before she could process the intensity in his voice, he reached out and took her hand. It was the smallest touch, just his fingers closing around hers, warm and strong and unbearably gentle. But it felt like lightning, like fire, like every forbidden thing she had ever wanted and never allowed herself to imagine. Violet's breath caught in her throat, and she looked up into grey eyes that were no longer cold at all. "You are not nothing," he said. "You are brave and kind, and worth more than 1,000 Hartleys. And whatever happens, whatever you decide, I want you to know that someone sees you, truly sees you. Not the performance, not the mask, but you." The tears she had been fighting spilled over, tracking silver lines down her cheeks. Sebastian made no move to wipe them away, simply stood there, holding her hand, bearing witness to her grief, with a steadiness that felt like a gift.
Why? She managed. Why do you care? You don't know me. We've barely spoken before this week. I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him something. A muscle flexed in his jaw, and his grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. I have spent a decade building walls to keep people out. I have made coldness into an art form. And then you fainted into my arms, and everything I thought I knew about myself ceased to make sense. Sebastian. His name on her lips felt dangerous, intimate, like a step onto uncertain ground. But she couldn't bring herself to call him Your Grace. Not now, not with his hand wrapped around hers, and the morning light catching the silver in his hair. I'm not a good man. His voice was rough, almost harsh. Whatever Helena may have told you, whatever you think you see in me, I am cold and difficult, and I have forgotten how to be otherwise. I will only disappoint you. Then disappoint me. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, fierce and certain. Disappoint.
Me 1,000 times. At least it will be real. At least it will be honest. I have had enough of pretty performances and charming lies to last a lifetime. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then Sebastian lifted his free hand to her face, his fingers brushing the tears from her cheek with unbearable tenderness. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, the line of her jaw, the corner of her trembling mouth. "I should not," he started. "I know. If anyone saw, I know. Violet." And then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined. Not that she had allowed herself to imagine it, not really, not in any concrete way. It was soft at first, questioning, as though he were giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, when she rose on her toes and pressed closer, her free hand fisting in the fabric of his coat, the kiss deepened into something that stole her breath entirely. He kissed her like a man who had been starving and only just realized it. His hand slid into her hair, scattering pins, tilting her head back to grant him better access. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him until she could feel the thunder of his heart against her chest. She had never been kissed like this. Hartley's rare, perfunctory embraces had left her cold, feeling more like property being inspected than a woman being desired. But this was something else entirely. This was fire and desperation and the sweet, aching relief of finally being known. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. "That was," he started. "A terrible idea," she finished, though she made no move to step away from him. "Catastrophically terrible. We shouldn't do it again." "Definitely not." A pause. Then, helplessly, "Once more?" His laugh was rusty, as though he had forgotten how to make the sound. "You're going to be my undoing, Lady Violet Ashworth. And you mine, Your Grace." He kissed her again, slower this time, savouring rather than devouring. The sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and rose, and for one perfect moment Violet forgot everything except the feeling of being held by someone who truly saw her. It couldn't last, of course. Nothing ever did. The days that followed were both the happiest and the most painful of Violet's life. She and Sebastian stole moments wherever they could, a touch in passing, a shared glance across the dinner table, early morning walks that had to end before the other guests rose. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. His childhood in the cold, draughty halls of Ashworth Castle, her secret poetry, the books they loved, the dreams they had abandoned. He told her about his mother's illness when he was 12, how his father's mistress had tried to poison the Duchess to claim the title for herself, how Sebastian had discovered the plot almost too late, how his mother had survived, but never fully recovered. He told her about the walls he had built afterward, the vow he had made to never let anyone close enough to hurt him, or those he loved. "I was 16 when I decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything," he said one evening, as they sat together in a shadowed corner of the garden, while the sounds of the house party drifted through the windows. "I've spent 16 years proving myself right, and then you came along and made me question everything I thought I knew. I'm sorry. Don't be." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Being numb was safe, but it was also a kind of death. "You've reminded me what it feels like to be alive." She fell a little more in love with him every day. It was terrifying, this feeling. She had never expected it, never sought it, had been convinced that love was something other people experienced while she was destined for duty and resignation. But here it was, undeniable and overwhelming, and she had no idea what to do with it. What she did know, with growing certainty, was that she could not marry Hartley. The realization settled into her bones gradually, like water seeping through stone. She thought about the letters he had sent, growing increasingly possessive as the wedding approached. She thought about his cold fury when she had returned from the ball, the threats barely concealed beneath his polished surface. She thought about a lifetime of monitoring her words, her food, her very thoughts to avoid his displeasure. And she thought about Sebastian, his gentle hands, his rare laughter, the way he looked at her as though she were precious beyond measure. There had to be another way. She would find it somehow, or she would break trying. On the 6th day of the house party, Hartley arrived. Violet was in the library when she heard the commotion, the sound of horses in the drive, voices raised in greeting, the bustle of unexpected guests. She set down the book of poetry she had been reading, Byron, Sebastian's favourite, and moved to the window, her heart already sinking. The carriage that stood in the circular drive bore the Hartley crest. "No." The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. "No, no, no." "Lady Violet?" The voice came from behind her, and she whirled to find Lady Helena standing in the doorway, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "I just received word Lord Hartley has arrived unexpectedly. He claims his business in London concluded early, and he wished to join you. He's checking on me." Violet's voice was flat, empty. He must have heard something. Rumours, gossip, something that made him suspicious. "He's come to make sure I'm behaving myself." Helena moved closer, lowering her voice. "My dear, if there's anything I should know, any reason you might need protection, there's nothing you can do." The words tasted like ashes in Violet's mouth. "He's my betrothed. In 2 weeks he'll be my husband. Whatever rights I have now will disappear entirely." "That's not true. You still have choices." "Do I?" Violet laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to humour. "My father gambled away our fortune. Hartley holds his vows. If I break the engagement, my family will be destroyed. My sisters will never marry. My parents will die in poverty, all because I was selfish enough to want something for myself. That's not selfishness. That's self-preservation." Before Violet could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and she barely had time to compose her features before Hartley swept into the room. He was handsome as ever, she noted distantly, golden-haired and blue-eyed, with the kind of aristocratic features that artists love to paint. When he smiled, he looked like every girl's dream of a fairy-tale prince. Only Violet knew how the smile never reached his eyes. "My darling." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands, lifting them to his lips. "You look well. The country air seems to agree with you." "Edward." She forced her voice to remain steady. "I wasn't expecting you." "A pleasant surprise, I hope?" His grip on her hands tightened, just a fraction, just enough to remind her who held the power. "I found myself missing you dreadfully. London was unbearably dull without your company." "How?" "Flattering. Lady Helena." Hartley turned his charm on their hostess, all warmth and courtesy. "I apologize for arriving without notice.
I do hope you can accommodate an additional guest. Of course, Lord Hartley. Helena's voice was cool, polite, but not welcoming. I'll have a room prepared immediately. Dinner is at 8. She swept out of the library, leaving Violet alone with her betrothed. The moment the door closed, Hartley's manner changed. I've heard interesting rumours. His voice dropped to a murmur, pleasant on the surface, deadly beneath. About you and a certain duke who seems to have taken an unhealthy interest in my future wife. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? He released her hands, and the absence of his touch was almost more frightening than the contact had been. The morning walks, Violet, the private conversations, the way you look at him when you think no one is watching. Did you think I wouldn't find out? There's nothing to find out. The Duke has been courteous, nothing more. The Duke is using you to get to me. Hartley began to pace, a predatory rhythm that made Violet's instincts scream. We were at Oxford together. Did you know that? He's despised me for 15 years, and now he thinks he's found a weapon. My own betrothed, turning against me. It's really quite clever. Sebastian isn't. She caught herself too late, watched Hartley's eyes narrow at her use of the Duke's Christian name. The Duke isn't using anyone. We've merely been friendly, as one is at house parties. Friendly? He stopped pacing, turning to face her with an expression that made her blood run cold. Let me be very clear, Violet. Whatever
game Ashworth is playing, you will not be part of it. You will avoid him for the remainder of this visit. You will speak to him only when absolutely necessary, and then only in company. And when we return to London, you will forget he exists. And if I don't? The words were out before she could stop them, propelled by a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Hartley went very still. If you don't, he said softly, I will destroy him, and then I will destroy everyone you love. Your father's debts are nothing compared to what I can do when properly motivated. Your sisters will be ruined, your mother will die of shame, and you— He stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. You will spend the rest of your life knowing that it was your selfishness that caused it all. Violet stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Do we understand each other, darling? She nodded once. Good. Hartley stepped back, the charming mask sliding back into place as easily as donning a coat. Now, I believe I'll rest before dinner. This journey has been quite exhausting. He left her standing alone in the library, shaking so badly she had to grip the window frame to stay upright. Dinner that evening was torture. Hartley played his role perfectly, charming and attentive, the devoted betrothed eager to be reunited with his bride. He kept Violet at his side throughout the evening, one hand always resting on her arm or her waist, marking his territory with every touch. When anyone addressed her directly, he answered for her. When she tried to speak, he talked over her. Sebastian watched from across the room, his grey eyes burning with a fury that he barely managed to contain. Violet could feel the tension building between the two men like a storm gathering on the horizon. Every time their gazes met, the air seemed to crackle with suppressed violence. Helena noticed it too. Her cheerful hostess manner was strained, and she kept steering conversation toward neutral topics whenever Hartley and Sebastian seemed about to speak to each other. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Hartley insisted on accompanying Violet rather than remaining for port with the gentlemen. I can't bear to be parted from her, he said with a smile that made Violet's skin crawl. Not after being separated for so many days. The other ladies cooed at his devotion. Violet said nothing. She was standing at the window staring out at the moonlit garden when Sebastian finally managed to approach her. Hartley had stepped away briefly to speak with Lady Helena, asking questions about the other guests, Violet suspected, gathering intelligence, and Sebastian materialized at her side like a shadow. Are you all right? His voice was barely above a whisper. You've barely spoken all evening. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're terrified. I can see it in your eyes. Sebastian. She glanced toward Hartley, making sure he was still occupied. He knows. About us. About the
walks, the conversations. Someone told him. A muscle worked in Sebastian's jaw. I'll handle it. You can't handle him. He's threatened to destroy you, destroy my family. He means it, Sebastian. He's capable of it. So am I. Sebastian's hand brushed hers, hidden from view by the curtains. I know things about Hartley that could ruin him 10 times over. If he thinks he can threaten you, that's exactly what he expects you to do. Violet's voice cracked. He said you're using me to get to him. That our whatever this is, it's all part of some game between the two of you. He said, and you believe that? The question hit her like a slap. She looked up at him, at the hurt barely visible beneath his careful control, and felt her heart splinter. I don't know what to believe anymore. Before Sebastian could respond, Hartley's voice cut across the room. Ashworth. The name was laced with false friendliness. I didn't expect to find you here. I thought you made a policy of avoiding social gatherings. Sebastian turned, his expression perfectly controlled. My cousin issued an ultimatum. I've learned not to argue with Helena when she sets her mind to something. Yes, Lady Helena can be quite persistent. Hartley moved to Violet's side, sliding his arm around her waist with proprietary ease. I trust you've been keeping my betrothed entertained in my absence? Lady Violet is delightful company. Sebastian's voice was ice, as I'm sure you know. I do indeed. Hartley's grip tightened on Violet's waist. She's a treasure. I'm quite looking forward to making her my wife. The words hung in the air, a challenge barely disguised as casual conversation. Violet felt the tension coiling between the two men, felt the storm about to break, and did the only thing she could think of. Edward, I'm feeling unwell. She made her voice thin, trembling. The journey from London, the excitement of your arrival, I believe I need to retire. Hartley's eyes narrowed, but he could hardly refuse such a request in front of witnesses. Of course, darling. Shall I escort you to your room? That won't be necessary. Helena appeared at her elbow, summoned by some hostess instinct. I'll see Lady Violet settled. You gentlemen enjoy your evening. Violet allowed herself to be guided away, but at the door she looked back one last time. Sebastian stood where she had left him, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an expression that made her chest ache. She did not know what that expression meant. She was terrified she would never find out. She heard them arguing that night. Her room was far from the gentleman's wing, but she had gone for a glass of warm milk from the kitchen. Sleep was impossible, her mind too full of fear and longing, and she had passed the library door just as voices rose to a volume that penetrated the heavy oak. Think I don't know what you're doing? Hartley's voice, sharp with fury. Using my own betrothed to humiliate me? It's pathetic, Ashworth. Even for you. This has nothing to do with you. Sebastian's response was controlled, but there was an edge to it that made Violet's heart pound. Lady Violet is a person, not a pawn in whatever rivalry you've imagined. Rivalry, Hartley laughed, an ugly sound. Is that what you call it? You've hated me for 15 years because of one little nothing. Eleanor Blackwood was not nothing. Sebastian's voice dropped to something deadly. She was an innocent girl, and you destroyed her for a wager, for entertainment, and she drowned herself because she couldn't live with what you'd done. The silence that followed was deafening. Is that what this is about? Hartley's voice had changed, turned silky with malice. You're still nursing that old wound. She was a vicar's daughter, Sebastian, a nobody who should have known better than to reach above her station. If she chose to throw herself in a river rather than face the consequences of her own choices, enough. The truth stings, doesn't it? You couldn't save her then, and you can't save Violet now.
She belongs to me. In 2 weeks, she'll be my wife, and there's nothing you can do about it. We'll see about that. Will we? Footsteps, moving toward the door. Violet shrank back into the shadows, her heart hammering. Be careful, Your Grace. You may have a title and a fortune, but I know things about you, about your family, about what really happened with your mother all those years ago. Cross me, and I'll ensure the whole ton knows every sordid detail. The door swung open, and Violet barely managed to slip into an alcove before Hartley strode past, his handsome face twisted with satisfaction. She waited until his footsteps faded, then crept back toward the library. Sebastian stood at the window, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. His hands were braced on either side of the frame, his head bowed, and even from the doorway Violet could see the tension in every line of his body. Sebastian. He turned, and the raw pain in his eyes stole her breath. You heard. Some of it. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Who was Eleanor Blackwood? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he moved to a chair and dropped into it heavily, like a man who had been carrying a burden for too long. She was the vicar's daughter in the village near Oxford. His voice was hollow. I was young 20, naive, still believing that the world was fundamentally fair. She was sweet and kind, and I thought perhaps... He trailed off, shaking his head. It doesn't matter what I thought. Hartley noticed her. He made a wager with his friends that he could ruin her within a month, and he did. Seduced her, promised marriage, then abandoned her publicly when he'd gotten what he wanted. Oh, God. I tried to stop it, tried to warn her, tried to intervene. But I was nobody, a second cousin to a duke, with no title, no power, nothing to wield against a viscount's son. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, it was too late. His hands clenched on the arms of the chair. She drowned herself in the Cherwell 3 days after he discarded her. She was 19 years old. Violet crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? I saw what was happening. I knew what kind of man he was, and I was too weak, too powerless to stop it. You were a boy. I was old enough to know right from wrong. He looked at her, and the anguish in his grey eyes was almost unbearable to witness. After Eleanor died, I swore I would never let anyone close enough to be used against me. I built my walls so high that no one could breach them. I thought if I never cared about anything, I could never be hurt again. And then I fell into your arms. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And then you fell into my arms. And I realized that all my walls were built on a foundation of cowardice. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just too afraid to try again. You're not a coward. Violet squeezed his hands fiercely. You're the bravest man I know. I'm really not. You are. She rose slightly, bringing her face level with his. You've spent 15 years carrying this guilt, and you're still willing to fight for me. Even knowing what Hartley could do, even knowing it might destroy you. I would let him destroy me 1,000 times, Sebastian said quietly, if it meant saving you from a single day of suffering. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. That's what I heard, Violet whispered. That's what made me understand. Understand what? That you've been telling the truth, about caring for me, about seeing me. She took a shaky breath. Hartley said you were using me as a weapon against him. And for a moment I almost believed it. Because believing that you could truly want me, truly love me, it seemed impossible. It's not impossible. Sebastian freed one hand and lifted it to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with infinite gentleness. Violet, I have spent my entire adult life convincing myself that I was incapable of love, that my heart had frozen over and could never thaw. And then you looked at me with those green eyes,
and I felt everything I'd been trying not to feel for 16 years. I love you. The words escaped before she could stop them, bold and terrifying and absolutely true. Sebastian went very still. You shouldn't, he said finally. I'm cold and difficult, and I will inevitably disappoint you. I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. Then learn. She pressed her forehead to his. Learn with me. Let me in. Let me love you, even when you're difficult. Especially when you're difficult. And Hartley? The name fell between them like a stone into still water. I don't know. Violet pulled back slightly, reality crashing over her like cold water. I don't know how to escape him. He holds my father's debts. He's threatened to destroy everyone I love. There has to be a way. I don't see one. Her voice cracked. I've been looking for 2 years, Sebastian. There is no exit from this trap. He's made certain of it. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Then we make our own exit. How? I don't know yet. He stood, drawing her up with him. But I will not let you marry that monster. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will find a way to free you. And if you can't? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. In the distance, a clock began to chime midnight. Violet listened to the toll of each hour, counting down the time she had left before her prison closed around her forever. 2 weeks, 14 days, and then she would belong to Hartley, and all the love in the world wouldn't be enough to save her. She left Rosewood Park the next morning. Hartley insisted, of course. There was business in London that required his attention, he said, and he couldn't possibly leave his beloved betrothed alone with the Duke of Ashworth lurking about. The words were pleasant, but the hand on her arm was a shackle, and Violet understood perfectly well that she was being taken prisoner. She managed one last look at Sebastian before the carriage pulled away. He stood on the steps of the manor house, Helena beside him, his face carved from stone. But his eyes, those grey eyes that had become her whole world, burned with a fury and a pain that matched her own. I will find a way, those eyes seemed to say. But as the carriage rattled down the drive and Hartley began to outline his expectations for the final weeks before the wedding, Violet felt the last fragile threads of hope beginning to unravel. She had found love, real love, the kind she had never believed she deserved. And now she was being dragged away from it, back to a future she could not escape. The tears she had been fighting slid silently down her cheeks, and she did not try to stop them. London was grey and cold when Violet returned, though it was high summer and the sun shone bright upon the fashionable streets of Mayfair. The greyness was inside her, a creeping fog that seeped into her bones and made every step feel like wading through water. 12 days until the wedding. Hartley had installed himself as a near-constant presence in her life, appearing at every meal, every outing, every moment she might otherwise have found solitude. Her mother, delighted by such attentive devotion, encouraged it at every turn. "Such a romantic," she sighed over breakfast. "He simply cannot bear to be parted from you. You're so fortunate, my dear." Fortunate. The word tasted like poison on Violet's tongue. She moved through the days like a ghost, performing the rituals expected of a bride. Final fittings for her wedding dress, a confection of cream silk and Belgian lace that cost more than most families earned in a year. Consultations with florists, caterers, musicians. Endless discussions of seating arrangements and menu selections and all, the trivial details that would make her imprisonment complete. Through it all, she thought of Sebastian. She had received no letters from him. Hartley monitored her correspondence now, barely bothering to disguise his surveillance. She had no idea whether he had tried to contact her, whether he was working on some plan to save her, whether he had given up entirely. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, a wound that refused to heal. Caroline visited on the 4th day after her return, her face pale with concern.
"You look terrible," she said without preamble, closing the door of Violet's bedroom firmly behind her. "Have you slept at all since you came back?" "Some." Violet sat at her dressing table, staring at her reflection without really seeing it. The shadows under her eyes had deepened to bruises. Her cheekbones stood out too sharply. She looked, she thought distantly, like someone already dead. "Enough. That's clearly a lie." Caroline crossed the room and took her hands, kneeling beside her the way Violet had knelt before Sebastian in the library at Rosewood Park. "Tell me what happened at the house party. Tell me everything." And so Violet told her, about Sebastian, about their walks in the garden, their conversations by the lake, the kiss that had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself, about Eleanor Blackwood, and the hatred between the two men that stretched back 15 years, about Hartley's arrival, his threats, the way he had dragged her back to London like a trophy he was claiming. When she finished, Caroline was silent for a long moment. "You love him," she said finally. "The Duke?" "Yes." "And he loves you?" "He says he does." Violet's voice cracked. "But what does it matter? In 12 days, I'll be Hartley's wife. Nothing Sebastian feels for me can change that." "Maybe not." Caroline's grip on her hands tightened. "But something has to change, Violet. You cannot marry that man. I know what you've said about father's debts, about protecting the family, but I would rather be ruined 1,000 times over than watch you destroy yourself in that marriage." "It's not your choice to make." "No, it's yours." Caroline's eyes were fierce. "And that's what terrifies me. Because you've been silenced for so long that you've forgotten you have a voice at all. You've convinced yourself that your suffering doesn't matter, that your happiness is worthless, that you deserve whatever fate the world hands you. And it's not true, Violet. None of it is true." The tears came then, silent and unstoppable. Violet had not allowed herself to cry since leaving Rosewood Park, had swallowed her grief the way she swallowed everything else, burying it so deep she could almost pretend it didn't exist. But Caroline's words cracked the shell she had built around her heart, and everything she had been holding back came pouring out. "I don't know how to fight any more," she whispered. "I don't know if I ever knew." "Then learn." Caroline gathered her into an embrace, holding her the way she had when they were children, and Violet had scraped her knee or lost a treasured toy. "Learn now, before it's too late. Find your voice and use it, because no one else can save you, Violet. Only you can do that. Only you can do that." The words echoed in Violet's mind long after Caroline had gone. 8 days before the wedding, Lady Helena Thornwood came to call. Violet was sitting in the morning room, pretending to work on embroidery, while her mother droned on about flower arrangements, when the butler announced their visitor. Hartley was elsewhere, one of his mysterious business meetings that seemed to consume more and more of his time, and Violet felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope. "Lady Helena!" She rose to greet her, trying to keep her voice steady. "How lovely to see you." "Lady Violet." Helena's embrace was warm, her eyes knowing. "I was in town and couldn't possibly leave without paying my respects. Mrs. Ashworth, I wonder if I might steal your daughter for a turn in the garden. I have some thoughts about wedding flowers that I simply must share." Violet's mother, flattered by the attention of such a fashionable widow, agreed readily. Moments later, Violet found herself walking through the small garden behind her family's townhouse. Helena's arm linked through hers. "He's going mad without you," Helena said without preamble. "I've never seen him like this. He barely eats, barely sleeps. He's been working day and night on something he won't tell me what, and he looks like a man possessed." "Is he—" Violet's voice caught. "Is he well?" "No, not remotely. He loves you, Lady Violet, and watching you be taken away from him is destroying him by inches." The words were a blade to her heart. "There's nothing to be done," Violet said dully. "Hartley holds my father's debts.
if I break the engagement. Actually, that's what I came to tell you." Helena stopped walking and turned to face her, something like triumph glinting in her eyes. "Sebastian has been investigating Hartley's finances. It seems his lordship is not quite so prosperous as he would have the world believe." Violet's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Hartley is drowning in debt himself. The vowels he holds from your father are only a fraction of what he owes to his own creditors. He needs your dowry, Violet, desperately. The marriage settlement your father agreed to includes properties that Hartley has already mortgaged twice over. If the wedding doesn't happen, he'll be ruined within the year." The information crashed over Violet like a wave. "He needs me," she breathed. "He's been threatening me with ruin, but he needs the marriage as much as I supposedly do." "More, actually. Sebastian has been quietly buying up Hartley's debts. By my cousin's calculation, he now owns enough of Hartley's paper to demand immediate payment that Hartley cannot possibly make without the funds from your marriage. But if I don't marry him, then Hartley goes to debtor's prison." Helena's smile was sharp. "And your father's vows become Sebastian's property. He's already told me that his first act will be to forgive them entirely. Your family will be free, Violet, truly free." It was too much to process. Violet sank onto a garden bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he send word?" "He tried. Hartley has been intercepting your correspondence. Sebastian suspected as much, which is why he sent me in person. He wanted you to know that there's a way out, that you don't have to marry that monster. But if I refuse, if I break the engagement publicly, the scandal will be enormous," Helena agreed. "There's no avoiding that. You'll be talked about for years. Society will have opinions. Some doors will close to you, at least temporarily. And Sebastian? What will happen to him?" "Sebastian doesn't care about any of that. He's been a social pariah by choice for years. What's a little more scandal to a man who never wanted to be part of society anyway?" Helena sat beside her on the bench, taking her hands. "The only question is whether you're brave enough to claim your freedom, to speak your truth, even knowing the cost. To speak your truth." Violet thought about all the years of silence, all the words swallowed, all the opinions suppressed. She thought about the woman she had been before her father's debts had sold her into bondage, a woman with dreams and hopes and a voice that deserved to be heard. She thought about Sebastian, working day and night to save her. And she thought about the life stretching before her, if she did nothing, years of servitude to a cruel man. Her spirit crushed, her poetry unwritten, her love unrequited. "There's a ball tomorrow night," she said slowly. "Lady Rothbury's summer gathering. Hartley and I are expected to attend." "I know. Sebastian will be there as well?" Violet looked up, meeting Helena's eyes. "Then that's where it ends. Tomorrow night, in front of all of society, I am going to speak my truth, whatever the cost." Helena's smile widened. "There she is. There's the woman Sebastian fell in love with." For the first time in weeks, Violet felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not quite, but something even more powerful. Determination. The night of Lady Rothbury's ball, Violet dressed with more care than she had taken with anything in months. She chose a gown of deep green silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, a gown Hartley hated because he said it made her look too bold, too noticeable. She wore her mother's emeralds, inherited from a grandmother who had scandalized society by marrying for love instead of money. She let her maid arrange her copper hair in an elaborate style that defied the severity Hartley preferred, and she studied her reflection in the mirror with something approaching recognition. This was who she was, not the pale, silent ghost Hartley had tried to make of her, but this woman fierce and frightened, and finally ready to fight. Her hands trembled as she pulled on her gloves, but her voice was steady when she descended the stairs and found Hartley waiting in the foyer. "You're wearing green,"
His displeasure was evident in the tightening of his jaw. "I've told you how I feel about that colour." "I know." Violet met his eyes without flinching. "I wanted to wear it anyway." Something flickered in his gaze, surprise perhaps, or the first warning of something darker. But they were not alone. Her mother hovered nearby, fussing with last-minute details, and Hartley could not express his displeasure openly. "We'll discuss this later," he said softly, taking her arm with the familiar bruising grip. "Yes," Violet agreed, "we will." The carriage ride to Lady Rothbury's was silent, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Violet stared out the window at the lamplit streets and tried to calm her racing heart. She had no idea what she was going to say, no plan beyond the desperate knowledge that she had to speak, had to break the silence that had been strangling her for years. The ballroom was a crush of silk and jewels, hundreds of candles casting their golden light over the cream of London society. Lady Rothbury greeted them at the door with effusive warmth, complimenting Violet's gown, remarking on what a handsome couple they made. It was a stage, Violet realized, a stage where she had been performing her entire life, playing the role others had assigned her. Tonight, she would rewrite the script. She spotted Sebastian almost immediately. He stood near the far wall, dressed in severe black, his grey eyes sweeping the crowd with apparent disinterest. But when his gaze found hers, the indifference vanished. Raw hope, desperate love, and fierce determination blazed from those grey depths with an intensity that made Violet's breath catch. "I'm here," she thought, willing him to understand. "I'm ready." Something in his expression shifted. A tiny nod, almost imperceptible. He understood. "Come." Hartley's voice was sharp. "Lord Pemberton wishes to speak with us about the wedding arrangements." Violet allowed herself to be led across the ballroom, nodding and smiling at the endless parade of well-wishers. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The orchestra played, couples danced, champagne flowed like water. And through it all, Violet waited. She was speaking with Lady Pemberton about wedding flowers, those eternal wedding flowers, when she felt the shift in the room's energy. Sebastian was approaching. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The Iron Duke, moving through the ballroom with purpose, heading directly toward Hartley and his betrothed. Hartley's hand tightened on Violet's arm. "What is he doing?" His voice was low, dangerous. "I don't know," Violet lied. Sebastian stopped before them, every eye in the room fixed on the tableau. His bow was precisely correct, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burned. "Lady Violet," his voice carried, pitched to reach the eager ears surrounding them. "I wonder if you might honor me with a dance." The request was audacious, unprecedented. A duke asking a betrothed woman to dance in front of her fiancé. It broke every rule of society, every code of conduct, every expectation of proper behavior. It was exactly the opening Violet needed. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." She pulled her arm free from Hartley's grip before he could stop her, placed her hand in Sebastian's, and allowed herself to be led to the dance floor. The whispers became a roar. "What are you doing?" Sebastian murmured as they took their positions. The orchestra, either oblivious or encouraged by the drama, struck up a waltz. "What I should have done months ago." Violet lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "I'm speaking my truth." The waltz began, and the world fell away. She had never danced with Sebastian before, but their bodies moved together as though they had been doing this forever. His hand on her waist was warm and steady, his grip on her fingers gentle but secure. He guided her through the steps with an ease that spoke of years of training, but his eyes never left her face. "Helena told you?" he asked. "Everything. Sebastian, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive the next few minutes." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Hartley,
looks ready to commit murder. Let him try. Violet felt reckless, wild, more alive than she had been in years. I'm done being afraid of him. Violet, I love you. The words came easily now, spoken in the middle of a crowded ballroom with 100 people straining to hear. I love you, and I'm done pretending otherwise. I'm done being silent, done being small, done being the woman everyone else wants me to be. Sebastian's hand tightened on her waist. And your engagement? Ends tonight. The music swelled toward its conclusion. Violet was dimly aware that the entire room had stopped pretending not to watch. Couples had abandoned their own dances. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Every face was turned toward the spectacle unfolding on Lady Rothbury's polished floor. When the final notes faded, Sebastian did not release her. Are you certain? His voice was rough. There's no going back from this. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He nodded once, then turned to face the crowd, keeping Violet's hand clasped firmly in his. I have an announcement to make. His voice cut through the buzz of whispers, commanding attention with an authority born of generations of aristocratic breeding. The ballroom fell silent. Many of you know that I have spent the past decade avoiding society's gatherings. I have been called cold, difficult, indifferent. All of those descriptions are accurate. A murmur of surprised laughter rippled through the crowd. But I have recently learned that coldness is not strength, it is cowardice, and there is a woman who has taught me that lesson. Sebastian turned to look at Violet, and the tenderness in his expression made her heart crack open. Lady Violet Ashworth is the bravest person I have ever known. She has spent years trapped in a situation not of her choosing, performing a role that was slowly destroying her, and tonight she has chosen to break free. This is outrageous! Hartley's voice shattered the moment. He pushed through the crowd, his handsome face mottled with fury. Violet, I don't know what this man has told you, but he is manipulating you, using you to settle an old score. No. Violet's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising even herself. You don't get to speak for me anymore, Edward. You don't get to tell me what I think, what I feel, what I believe. That ends now. The ballroom was utterly silent. You are nothing without me. Hartley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a vicious hiss that still carried in the breathless quiet. Your father's debts are no longer your concern. Sebastian's voice was ice. I own them now, as I own your debts, Hartley. All of them. What little colour remained in Hartley's face drained away. You're bluffing. Am I? Sebastian reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of papers. The vowels you hold from the Earl of Thornbury, acquired through my solicitor yesterday. The mortgage on your country estate, which came due last month. The gambling debts from 5 different London clubs, purchased for pennies on the pound because your credit has become rather questionable. He smiled, and it was the coldest expression Violet had ever seen. You have been threatening Lady Violet with ruin for months. How does it feel to face it yourself? You can't, you wouldn't. I can, I would, I am. Sebastian stepped forward, putting himself between Hartley and Violet. You have 2 choices. You will release Lady Violet from her engagement immediately and publicly, citing irreconcilable differences. You will never contact her or her family again. You will leave London by the end of the week and retire to whatever continental watering hole will have you. In exchange, I will give you 1 year to settle your affairs before I call in your debts. And if I refuse? Then I call in every marker I hold tomorrow morning, and you spend the next decade in debtor's prison contemplating your choices. Sebastian's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than shouting. I hear conditions there are quite unpleasant. Nothing like the life of luxury you've been pretending to afford. Hartley's face twisted with hatred. For a moment Violet genuinely feared he would launch himself at Sebastian, society be damned. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, with a visible effort, Hartley mastered himself. Fine. The word emerged through gritted teeth. The engagement is off.
But this isn't over, Ashworth. Not by a long shot. Actually, it is. Violet stepped out from behind Sebastian, claiming her place at his side. It's over, Edward. I'm done being afraid of you. I'm done letting you control me, and if you ever threaten me or my family again, I will personally ensure that every drawing room in London knows exactly what kind of man you are. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to flinch. Something in Hartley's expression shifted surprise, perhaps, at the steel he had never suspected lay beneath her compliant surface. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Hartley turned on his heel and strode from the ballroom, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. The silence held for another heartbeat. Then the whispers exploded. "Did you see? The Duke, of all people, her engagement, broken in public? Never witnessed anything so?" Violet heard none of it. She was looking at Sebastian, and Sebastian was looking at her, and everything else had ceased to matter. "You did it," he said softly. "You found your voice. I had help." She reached up, touching his face. "I had you." Violet. And then, in full view of London society, the Duke of Ashworth kissed her. The whispers became gasps. Somewhere a woman shrieked. Lady Rothbury might have fainted or cheered. It was impossible to tell. But Violet registered none of it. There was only Sebastian, his lips on hers, his arms around her, his heart beating against her chest. There was only this moment, this choice, this declaration that she was finally free. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, the ballroom was in complete chaos. "We should probably leave," Sebastian said, a hint of that rusty laughter in his voice. "Probably?" Violet couldn't stop smiling. "I believe we've caused quite enough scandal for one evening." He took her hand and led her through the gaping crowd, and not a single person tried to stop them. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The scandal, as predicted, was immense. The gossip sheets devoted entire editions to dissecting what had happened at Lady Rothbury's ball. Some called Violet a shameless fortune hunter. Others called her a romantic heroine. Sebastian was alternately praised for his dramatic rescue and condemned for his interference in another man's engagement. Neither of them cared. Violet's father, once the initial shock had passed, proved surprisingly supportive. He had never liked. Hartley had agreed to the engagement only because he saw no other way to save his family, and the revelation of Sebastian's offer to forgive his debts left him nearly speechless with gratitude. "I don't deserve such generosity," he said to Sebastian when the Duke came to call formally. "I sold my daughter to a monster to cover my own mistakes." "You did what you thought was necessary." Sebastian's voice was kind. "And you're giving me the chance to make it right. That's all that matters." Caroline was delighted, arriving in London the moment she heard the news and embracing Violet with tears of joy streaming down her face. "I knew you would find your courage," she said. "I knew you had it in you all along." "I almost didn't," Violet admitted. "I almost let him win." "But you didn't. That's what matters." Helena appointed herself unofficial wedding planner, declaring that her cousin's marriage would be the event of the decade. "After years of watching him brood in corners, he deserves a proper celebration," she insisted. "And so do you, my dear, so do you." The courtship, such as it was, became the talk of the ton. Sebastian was spotted bringing Violet flowers every morning, not the fashionable hothouse blooms that were expected, but wildflowers gathered from the meadows outside London, the kind she had mentioned loving in a conversation he had somehow remembered. He took her riding in Hyde Park, walking in Kew Gardens to the theatre and the opera and every public venue where they could be seen together, slowly transforming the scandal into something approaching acceptance. And at night, when the public performances ended, they sat together in the drawing-room of Violet's family home, properly chaperoned, of course, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. "I never expected this," Sebastian admitted one evening, 3 weeks after the ball. "Any of it. I had resigned myself to a life of solitude, convinced that caring for someone would only lead to pain. And now? Now I can't imagine going back to that emptiness." He took her hand, tracing patterns on her palm. "You've changed everything, Violet. You've reminded me what it means to feel alive." "You've done the same for me." She shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "I was disappearing before you caught me. I was becoming nothing, and you saw me, really saw me, and refused to let me vanish. I will always see you." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Even when you try to hide. Especially when you try to hide." The engagement was announced formally a month after the scandal, once the initial furor had died down to manageable levels. Sebastian proposed properly in the garden at Rosewood Park, where they had first walked together, with Helena hovering at a discreet distance to ensure propriety. He knelt in the grass, heedless of his immaculate trousers, and offered her not the family diamonds, those would come later, but a simple gold band set with a single emerald. "It matches your eyes," he said. "And it reminded me of that green dress, the one you wore to Lady Rothbury's ball, the one that made you look like yourself for the first time." Violet laughed through her tears. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything about you." He slid the ring onto her finger. "Marry me, Violet. Teach me how to be warm. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you." "You already deserve me." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly. "But yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything." The wedding took place in the autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and the air was crisp with the promise of change. It was held at Ashworth Castle, Sebastian's ancestral seat, which he had avoided for years because it reminded him too much of his cold, lonely childhood. But with Violet at his side, even that gloomy pile of stone seemed to glow with warmth. The ceremony was small by aristocratic standards, attended only by those who truly mattered. Violet's family, Sebastian's aunt and cousin, a handful of genuine friends. No society acquaintances, no political alliances, no one who was there merely to see and be seen. When Violet walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a simple cream gown with her grandmother's emeralds, Sebastian's eyes filled with tears. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she reached his side. "So are you." She took his hand. "Shall we do this?" "There's nothing I want more." The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the look in their eyes spoke of promises far deeper than any words could capture. To love, to cherish, to honor, but also to see, to hear, to never let the other disappear. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Sebastian kissed her for the first time as his duchess, Violet felt something inside her shift and settle into place. She was home. 8 years later. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls of Ashworth Castle, punctuated by the frantic barking of 2 very enthusiastic spaniels and the exasperated calls of a nursemaid who had clearly given up any pretense of control. Violet looked up from her writing desk, a smile tugging at her lips. "I believe our offspring are attempting to murder the dogs," she remarked to her husband, who stood at the window watching the chaos unfold in the garden below. "The dogs seem to be enjoying it." Sebastian turned, and the love in his grey eyes, still grey, still intense, but now warm where once they had been cold, made her heart skip as it had from the very first moment. "Though I suspect Nurse Peters is contemplating a change of profession. Can you blame her? 3 children under the age of 7 would try anyone's patience. 4. Soon." Sebastian crossed to her desk and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, one hand coming to rest on the gentle swell of her belly. "Are you feeling well? You shouldn't be working so hard." "I feel wonderful." Violet set down her pen and leaned back into his embrace. "And the publisher is expecting the manuscript by Christmas." I refuse to let a minor inconvenience like pregnancy delay me. Minor inconvenience? Sebastian laughed a real laugh, warm and easy, nothing like the rusty sound that had escaped him in those early days. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever known. You love me for it. I do. God help me, I absolutely do. Through the window, Violet could see their children, James, 7, with his father's dark hair and serious grey eyes, Catherine, 5, copper-haired and freckled, already showing the fierce determination that Violet recognized as her own, and little Rose, barely 3, toddling after her siblings with cheerful disregard for her own limitations. They were wild, these children of theirs. Wild and loud and occasionally completely impossible. They had transformed Ashworth Castle from a cold mausoleum into a home full of noise and mess and joy. Sebastian had been terrified, that first year of marriage, terrified that he wouldn't know how to be a father, that his own cold upbringing had broken something essential in him, that he would damage his children the way his parents had damaged him. Violet had held his hand through every fear. "You are not your father," she had told him on the night James was born, as Sebastian held his tiny son with hands that trembled. "You never will be, because you care whether you hurt him. That caring is everything." He had learned slowly to trust himself, to be warm when warmth was needed, to be steady when steadiness was required. To show his children what he had never been shown, that love was not weakness, that vulnerability was not destruction, that feeling everything was better than feeling nothing, and Violet had learned too. She had learned to speak her truth even when it was difficult. She had learned that her voice had power, that her words mattered, that she was worth fighting for. The poetry she had hidden for so many years was now published under her own name, the Duchess of Ashworth, writing verse about love and loss and the courage required to choose happiness. Some in society still whispered about the scandal that had brought them together. Let them whisper, Violet thought. Their whispers could not touch her here, in this castle full of chaos and laughter and love. "Do you remember," Sebastian said softly, "the night I caught you at the Duchess of Richmond's ball? How could I forget? It was the most humiliating moment of my life. It was the best moment of mine." He turned her chair so she faced him, kneeling beside her the way he had on the day he proposed. "I had spent so many years being numb, being cold, being nothing, and then you fell into my arms, and everything changed. I fainted, Sebastian. It was hardly romantic. It was exactly romantic." He took her hands, raising them to his lips. "You fell into the wrong arms, and somehow they turned out to be exactly right." Violet felt the tears pricking at her eyes. Pregnancy made her emotional. She would blame it on that, and leaned forward to rest her forehead against his. "I love you," she said. "I know I say it every day, but I don't think I'll ever tire of saying it." "I hope not. I certainly won't tire of hearing it." From the garden, a shriek of childish delight pierced the air, followed by an almighty splash. "Someone has found the ornamental pond," Sebastian observed. "Should we intervene?" "Probably, but I find I'm quite comfortable here." Violet laughed, and the sound was full and free, and everything she had once been afraid she would never feel. She had spent so many years silent, so many years small, so many years convinced that her happiness was not worth fighting for. Now she knew better. "Come on." She pulled Sebastian to his feet, keeping hold of his hand. "Let's go rescue our children from their own adventures." "Must we?" "We must. Though I should warn you, I believe James was planning something involving frogs." Sebastian groaned, but he was smiling as they made their way through the castle, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had never known joy like theirs, past servants who smiled at the unconventional Duke and Duchess who had transformed this cold house into a home. In the garden, chaos reigned. James was indeed covered in pond water. Catherine was attempting to capture a frog, Rose was crying because she wanted to help but couldn't quite manage it, and Nurse Peters looked ready to collapse. "Right," Sebastian said, rolling up his sleeves. "James, out of the pond. Catherine, release the frog. Rose, come to Papa." The children obeyed with minimal protest. They adored their father. This man who played with them and read to them and told them every day that they were loved. Sebastian scooped Rose into his arms, pressing a kiss to her tear-stained cheek, and something in Violet's chest expanded until she thought it might burst. This was her life now, noise and chaos and love so fierce it sometimes frightened her. This was what she had almost lost. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been on the night of the Duchess of Richmond's ball. Silent, disappearing, convinced that her future held nothing but suffering. That woman felt like a stranger now, a ghost from another life. She had found her voice. She had found her strength. She had found a love that healed instead of destroyed, that built up instead of tearing down. And it had all started with a moment of weakness, a swoon, a fall, a pair of grey eyes in a crowded ballroom. Sebastian caught her gaze across the garden, their children between them, the autumn sun warm on their faces. He smiled that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip, and Violet smiled back. She had fainted into the wrong arms, and they had caught her, exactly when she needed to fall.